A snapshot is a wonderful tool that we can use to go back to a point in time for a specific virtual machine. An example of using one would be this. Let's imagine that you and I have a virtual machine. Let's call it Virtual Machine 1. And let's say this is the perfect virtual machine. However, as time goes on, we need to change something. Maybe we have to install a patch, or install an update, or make a configuration change. And one important element about making changes to a system is to make sure we test them. So with a VM that we need to test, for example, the patches or updates or configs before we roll it out, for example, to the rest of the company, it would be nice as we practice with these updates or patches if we had an opportunity to go ahead and do a reset back to the base image or the way it was before we started. And that way we could try a patch, oops, there's a problem or an issue, roll it back. Or do an update and roll it back. And that ability to reset or to go back in a point of time for a virtual machine is exactly what a snapshot brings to the table. A snapshot is not intended as a backup mechanism for your virtual machine, but rather it's intended for a fairly short-term purpose of being able to go back to a virtual machine at a specific time. And then once you've got everything dialed in, you've got the patch perfect, or you've tested the security update, you can then go ahead and get rid of the snapshots and move forward with that VM. Maybe convert it to a template and then create VMs based on that template. Now, regarding how VMware pulls this off, we know a few things about virtual machines. We know that a virtual machine with its guest operating system running on an ESXi host is really all kept as a set of files on a data store. So for example, VM1, there'd be a folder called VM1, which would have all the files. And so if we take a closer look at those files, for example, here we have a VM. Here's the VM's folder, and here's the contents of that folder on the data store. We've taken a look at several of these previously. We have a configuration file for the VM, and we have the hard disk for the VM. So as we browse the data store, these two files are really making up the hard drive. The VMDK is the descriptor file, and the -flat is the data file where everything's kept. And just as a heads up, as we browse the data store inside of vSphere, all it shows us is the descriptor file, which includes the size of the flat. So these two are kind of a package deal, and it hides the flat.vmdk from the browse view. Although these are the two files that represent effectively the hard drive for that VM. So let's imagine that we have a VM, and before we do patches or updates, we want to go ahead and take a snapshot at point in time A. So what we do in vSphere is we right-click on the virtual machine, hover over the snapshot option, and then from the submenu select take a snapshot. And so maybe at point in time A, we create snapshot 1. Now when we create a snapshot, behind the scenes what happens is the original hard drive, and I'm going to go ahead and do the descriptor file and the data file for the purposes of this discussion, they are effectively now made read-only. And for snapshot 1, a new set of VMDKs is created. We have a descriptor file and then the -delta file, which is where the effective hard drive changes are being kept in the delta file. And that delta is now a read-write. So here we have the flat or the original hard drive, and then for snapshot 1 we have the delta. And once that snapshot is created, snapshot 1, any time that VM writes to the hard drive, the data is actually being written to the delta disk. And if we're working with the VM and we're making some changes and they don't go well, we could always revert back to that point where the snapshot is and start over. So this snapshot, snapshot 1, maybe in the description we call this the base VM before patches. And then if we need to test 5 different times or 5 different ways of implementing the updates or the patches, after every attempt and every try, we can then revert back to that snapshot to go back to the way it was before we started testing and working with the patches. Now, when we created this snapshot, snapshot 1, if the machine was powered on when we created the snapshot, it also gives us an option to capture the memory state of that virtual machine. And if we did so, it would be kept in this file right here with an extension of VMEM. So for the first snapshot, it would be the name of the VM, a whole bunch of zeros and a 1.vmem. And so if the VM had 4 gigs of memory, that vmem file would be approximately 4 gigs as well. So we have 2 other files as well. We have a .vmsn and a .vmsd. The .vmsn is a snapshot configuration state file. For example, was the machine powered on or powered off when this snapshot was taken? There's also a coordination file, which is .vmsd. They call it a snapshot data file. And this has the names and descriptions and the relationships for all the snapshots. So if we have snapshot 1 and snapshot 2 and snapshot 3, the .vmsd is keeping track of all those that exist for a VM. And when snapshots are created, they're presented in the form of a tree. For example, at the very top, if we had 5 snapshots, for example, we'd have snapshot 1, and then below that we'd have snapshot 2, and then 3, then 4, then 5. And the concept about the delta disks for each one of those and the memory state information file, if we captured memory for each of those snapshots, would also be part of the file system for that VM. So the cool thing is, if we're currently running the VM right here and we decide, oh, we want to revert back to the state it was here at snapshot 3, or we want to revert back to the state it was at snapshot 1, all we do is tell the system we want to revert back to that state, select the snapshot, and it will revert back to that state for us. Another thing we can do with snapshots is we can delete the ones that we no longer need. So for example, if we're currently running a VM and we decide, you know what, we really don't need snapshot 3 or snapshot 4 anymore, we can go ahead and delete those, which will save us some disk space, but it also means that we can't return to those snapshots if they're deleted. And if we decide that we don't want any of our snapshots anymore, everything's great, we don't need to return back to a previous state, and let's imagine that we still have all 5 snapshots in place. What we can do is we can say we want to delete all snapshots. And effectively what it's going to do is it's going to take all of the data in all of the delta disks and it's going to merge them back into the parent disk. So the parent flat.vmdk, which represents the hard disk file for that VM, all of the changes are going to be rolled up into that original disk and all these snapshots would then be deleted. So in the hands-on lab, what I'd like to do is let's walk through some scenarios of where we can create, verify, and manage our snapshots. So here in the vSphere web client, let's go ahead and pick on a victim that we'll go ahead and practice our snapshots with. And to do that, let's use VM5. So we'll click on the icon for VM and templates over here in the navigator pane, and then let's select VM5. Now when working with snapshots for that VM, we could go ahead and select that VM, and then there's a tab right here for snapshots. So let's go ahead and click on snapshots. And at the moment, we don't have any current snapshots for that VM. And to create a snapshot, what we would do is we could right-click on the VM, and then from the menu, hover over Snapshots, and then from the submenu, simply select Take Snapshot. We also have for this VM, if we have it selected, we have an Actions drop-down up here as well. Same drop-down. Depends on whether you want to right-click on the VM itself or simply click on the Actions drop-down. And then once again, we have the Snapshots, and then Take Snapshot. Now before we take any snapshots, let's go take a gander, take a look at the actual files in the file system that make up that VM. So for VM5, if we want to see what data store it's using, there are several ways of doing it. Because we're right here with VM5 selected, we can simply click on data stores. And that will show us. So vSphere is currently using the iSCSI data store to support the files for VM5. If we want to browse that data store, we could go ahead and click here on the icon for Browse Files. And what that does, it takes us to the Storage tab with the iSCSI data store selected and drops us on the Files tab for that data store. And then if we click on VM5 here, the folder, it will show us the files for that virtual machine which is currently powered off. And the files I'd like to bring your attention to are the VMX, that's our configuration file. There's our VMDK, the disk descriptor. Now behind that is the actual data file, the flat.vmdk, which is a little over 4 gigs in size. The VMSD, which is keeping track of all our snapshots, the descriptions, and the relationships for the snapshots. Currently it is 0K because we don't have any snapshots. So that's what the before picture looks like, before any snapshots. So let's go back to the VM. So we'll click on the tab for VMs and templates. And with VM5 selected, let's go ahead and click on the Snapshots tab once again. And let's power on this machine. So because VM5 is selected, there's an icon right here we can use to power on the virtual machine. And I'm also going to take the browser out of full screen mode with F11 so we can have multiple tabs to go back and forth between the virtual machine and the vSphere web client. And then we can click on this icon here to go ahead and launch a console to that virtual machine. So there's our beautiful virtual machine. And let's create a snapshot of this machine as it is right now, and we'll refer to this as our base image before making any subsequent changes. So we'll go back to the vSphere web client. We'll right click on the VM, and from the action menu for that VM, we'll hover over snapshots and click on Take Snapshot. Let's call this Snapshot 1. And for the description, we'll call this base image before changes. And because the VM is running, we have the option for getting a snapshot of the virtual machine's memory that would be put into the vmem file. Or if we didn't want to capture the memory state of that virtual machine, we could go ahead and remove that check, and then we could also, as an option, select Quiesce Guest File System. Now that's a good thing. If there's something that the VM needs to write to disk but just hasn't quite got around to it yet, this option of quiescing the guest file system will help us in getting that information written to disk so that if we ever restore, we can get everything that was intended to be on the disk. And vSphere can do that with that VM because VMware Tools is installed on the virtual machine. Alright, for our nugget, let's go ahead and capture the memory state as well. So we'll put a check in that first checkbox and click OK. Now, this may take a few minutes for it to capture everything, create the Delta disk. And what we can do is we can click on Recent Tasks and just watch it complete. And so once it does complete, we'll have our very first snapshot. And it is done. So to minimize this, we could actually click anywhere else that we wanted to, or we could click down here on Recent Tasks again, which will cause that to minimize. And there's our first snapshot. So let's you and I implement a change. Let's go back to that VM, and let's say that we're going to implement a patch. Let's call it patch 2.0. Now, because I don't have a patch 2.0 handy on me, let's create a folder on the desktop that's easy to visually see, and we'll call it patch 2.0. So we'll right click on the desktop. From the menu, we'll select Create Folder, and then let's call it patch 2.0 installed. And then we'll click on Create. And let's also move this. Let's move this over here where it's very easy to visually see that difference here on the desktop. We'll just pretend that that is patch 2.0. And with that patch installed, let's go ahead back to the vSphere web client and create another snapshot. So we'll go to the Actions menu for that VM, hover over Snapshots, and once again, from the submenu, we'll click Take Snapshot. Let's call this Snapshot 2. Let's give it a description, and we'll also capture the memory for this virtual machine state as well, and click OK. And then we'll click on Recent Tasks, make sure it finishes, and then we'll continue. Alright, it's done. So let's go ahead and make one more change and one more snapshot. So we'll go back to the desktop for VM5. We'll right click on that desktop. We'll select Create Folder from the drop down. And let's call this patch 3.0 installed. And click on Create. And let's also move that over here. So once again, it's very visually easy to see which instance of the VM we're looking at. The one with no patches, the one with patch 2, or the one with patch 2 and 3. So with patch 3 applied, let's go back to the vSphere client and create a snapshot of that as well. So once again, we'll go ahead and click on the Actions menu for VM5 and hover over Snapshots and click on Take Snapshot. We'll call this Snapshot 3. We'll give it a description of just installed patch 3. And I got to tell you, the descriptions are really important to remember what the heck that snapshot was for. If there's just dates or times, and then maybe a couple days go by and you go back and look at it, it's not always easy to remember what state you were looking at or what snapshot you captured. So include a description, the life you save, maybe your own. We'll capture the memory as well and click on OK. And we'll give that a moment or two to complete. We can either watch the recent tasks or simply just wait for that snapshot to show up here under the Snapshots tab for that VM. And we can also click on Refresh if we think that the snapshot's done, but it's just the screen that's not refreshing yet. So that looks great. There's Snapshot 1, Snapshot 2, and Snapshot 3. Also, one of the cool things about this is that in this little preview of the virtual machine, you can actually see the two folders on the desktop that represent patch 2 and patch 3. It's also showing us information about disk usage, when it was created, and whether or not we captured the memory as well. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and power off this virtual machine. So with VM5 selected, we'll go ahead and click on this icon here to shut down the guest operating system. And because of VMware Tools, it'll be a nice, graceful shutdown. So we'll click on Yes, and give that a moment to go ahead and go down. And let's go take a look at the file system to look at the files that are supporting these 3 snapshots. So to do that, we'll go ahead and click on the Storage tab. When we left the Storage tab, it was on the iSCSI data store. It takes us back to that point. We were also on the Files tab, which it also took us back to. So let's go ahead and click on VM5 and take a look at the files for VM5. And let's also go ahead and sort these. I'm going to go ahead and click on the Name column, and that's going to sort in ascending order. And if we clicked again, the little down arrow indicates it's descending order. So let's go ahead and look at this in ascending order and take a look at the files. So here we have the original hard disk descriptor file for VM5. And behind that we have the flat.vmdk. And then here we have 3 descriptor files, one for each of the 3 snapshots that we just took. And behind each of those descriptor files, we have the delta disks. And there's the size of those delta disks. And because we captured the memory for each of the snapshots, we're going to have a vmem file for each one, 1, 2, and 3. We also have a state configuration file for each one of the snapshots. That's these vmsn files, 1, 2, and 3. And then we have the file that's keeping track of all of the files associated with snapshots for this VM and their relationships, and that's this bad boy right here, the .vmsd, which is no longer 0 in size, it's now 1.16 kilobytes. So in the vSphere web client, as we're taking a look at all the snapshots, vSphere is relying on this file to correctly represent those snapshots that are associated with this VM in the graphical user interface. So let's go back to the VM and Templates tab here. And then with VM5 selected, let's go ahead and revert back to the point where we just installed patch 2.0. And that's when we took snapshot 2. Now to confirm that, we can click on snapshot 2, and then in the description where it says just installed patch 2.0, that can confirm that's where we want to go to. Also, let me close the tab here for VM5. Currently, VM5 is powered off. However, because the snapshot 2 that we took was the running machine and we captured the memory, when we restore to snapshot 2, it's going to restore to a running virtual machine with that single patch installed, patch 2.0. So with snapshot 2 selected from this all actions menu, now this all actions is referring to the snapshots, and the actions up here at the top is referring to VM5. So from the all actions drop down, we're going to go ahead and click on revert to. It's confirming, do you want to revert to snapshot 2? And we'll say yes. And it'll take just a few moments. We can click on recent tasks to watch that happen. So that's completely done. And now check this out. VM5 is running because that's the state that snapshot 2 took, was of a running machine, and we captured the memory. So when you revert to that, it brings up that machine in that state, which is running. So now if we open up a console to VM5, you'll notice we have patch 2.0 installed and we don't have patch 3. That's in the future from the snapshot perspective. So if we go back to the vSphere web client, there's a parent-child relationship with the snapshots. So snapshot 1 is a parent to snapshot 2, which is the child. And snapshot 3 would be a child to snapshot 2, who would be a parent to snapshot 3. And because we just reverted back to snapshot 2, it's showing us visually where we are currently regarding the state of the VM. So if we wanted to delete a snapshot, we could just select it and then click on delete, and it would delete the snapshot. Or if we wanted to get rid of all snapshots, we could simply say we want to delete all snapshots. And what's going to happen is snapshot 3 is going bye-bye. That's never coming back. And snapshot 2 and snapshot 1 are going to be effectively rolled in to the original VMDK file for the VM, for that disk. Now if you have 5 or 6 different disks, you're going to have separate delta files for each of the disks for a snapshot. So with this VM, because it only has one original disk, any changes that we had implemented at the point of snapshot 1 or snapshot 2, those are all going to be integrated and combined and merged with the original disk, the flat disk, which is represented by the descriptor file .vmdk. So let's go ahead and click on yes to consolidate. We'll click on recent tasks to verify that that's going to complete. And now that it's done, all of our snapshots are gone. And if we were to look at the file system for VM5, let's go ahead and power off the VM, and I'll confirm that with a yes. That'll give us a few less files to sort through in the data store. It also gives us a fairly equal comparison because originally, before our first snapshot, we looked at the files for that VM when it was currently powered off. So now we'll click on the storage icon. With the iSCSI data store selected and the files tab selected, we are going to click on this refresh icon here regarding the data store content, so we can make sure we're looking at the latest information regarding that folder in the data store. So all of the delta disks are gone. They've all been merged with the parent disk, which is being represented by this descriptor file. And now, my friend, it is your turn. I would encourage you to reinforce the concepts that we've talked about in this nugget by doing the hands-on practice in working with and managing snapshots. So have some fun, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.